How do you feel watching this video? When I watch it, I get sick to my stomach, my hands and my armpits get sweaty, and I feel like a tingly feeling in my arms and upper body. But not everyone has the same reaction to heights. Others seek it out and are much less averse to the experience. Scientists have studied the fear of heights and found that most infants either fear or avoid heights. And evolutionary psychologists argue that this fear or avoidance should be innate or evolved in us through evolution. This video is going to be about evolutionary psychology. And it's clear to me that the science has been sucked into the culture wars. I think our fear and avoidance of heights is a great example to explore evolutionary psychology because it's one of the examples that has very little political repercussions. So it's not likely to trigger people emotionally one way or the other, depending which political side of the spectrum they're on. It's also a really great example of the balance between what parts of our psychology are innate and adaptable, or how much of our psychology is nature versus nurture. But we'll explore this topic more later in the video. Since evolutionary psychology is so politicized, I want to establish right away that I am not conservative. I am a progressive. I have been a climate change activist for over 20 years, and in terms of my political leanings, I am a Bernie-style democratic socialist who has actually volunteered for the Bernie campaign. I believe in universal health care. I want to eliminate wealth inequality. I believe in the empowerment of women. I am pro-choice and pro-birth control. I love and support LGBTQ people. I have a lot of very close friends and family in that community, and I love them a lot, and I have no interest in undermining them politically. I want to support them politically. I'm also someone who very much believes in the theory of evolution, and this channel is very much about embracing the principle of evolution, the will to survival. On my channel, I will consistently argue that progressive politics is more consistent with this underlying principle of evolution. It's consistent with survival. And to learn more about my own political approach, check out my climate politics video. On a similar note, I should emphasize that I haven't been sucked into the conservative bubble in any way. I agree that conservatives usually glean the wrong things from evolutionary psychology, especially often racist and sexist conclusions. For example, I think clavicular movement of looks maxing is ridiculous. I think Jordan Peterson is not scientific, and the fact that he's a climate change denier makes it so that I really can't take anything that he says seriously, even though I know he is a legitimate academic. I've never seen a full episode of Joe Rogan in my life, and also find it hard to take him seriously, but I don't think that conservatives are the only political group that misinterprets evolutionary psychology or is irrationally for or against evolutionary psychology. And by the end of this video, I'll introduce some litmus tests to determine whether a person is more ideologically driven in regards to evolutionary psychology science or is more principled scientifically. Briefly, let's just define evolutionary psychology. First, we have to understand evolution, which is the idea that species have evolved over time in such a way that the mutations that species undergo that increased the probability of survival in their environment were the ones that were passed on from one generation to the next. And this theory of evolution has a really enormous scientific consensus. 97% of scientists believe in evolution, and none of the peer-reviewed studies that are published in scientific journals deny evolution. There is a huge consensus on this scientific theory. And then there's the question of how evolution might impact psychology. A good way to understand this is through the gene-centered view of evolution, which posits that individual animals like me and you are simply just vessels that are being used by our DNA to propagate itself. And sometimes that means that we will do things that are harmful or painful for ourselves and that take a lot of effort in order to increase the probability that our DNA will be dominant over future generations. You can study evolution's impact on psychology through animal behavior, which looks at how non-human animals' behavior has evolved over time. And more controversially, through evolutionary psychology, you could look at how human psychology is influenced by evolution. So animal behavior and evolutionary psychology are basically the same approach, but applied to either non-human animals or humans like us. And just a little bit about me. 20 years ago, I took an introduction to psychology course where I got B+. I took an animal behavior course where I also got B+, and I got an A in evolutionary psychology. I mentioned this partially just to reiterate that my interest in this school of science and psychology didn't result from the manosphere. I was interested in this way before there was ever that internet bubble. But I'm not making the argument that I'm an expert or ever was an expert in psychology, just giving you my background. And the goal of this video is to defend the position that human psychology is at least partially influenced by evolution. In concert with my last video, I'm making the argument that it's anthropocentric to deny that evolutionary psychology has influence over people entirely. I don't really need to defend, and I will not defend, every single evolutionary psychology theory. Some of them have been way off and completely wrong. What I am going to do is explore evolutionary psychology by reviewing a few left-wing criticisms. And my goal in this video is to do this in a scientifically accurate way. The general thesis that I'm running with is that most psychology is not fully baked. And through researching this video, it is clear to me that there are some significant disagreements and a lot of contradictory research related to evolutionary psychology. The current general consensus, though, is that human psychology is partially innate and partially evolved and partially learned, and that people are very adaptable. Another part of my thesis is that I recommend that you, the viewers, get as much information as you can directly from scientific experts, because there is so much debate happening in the scientific community, and that those scientific experts should be people who are researching and publishing actively in relevant psychological fields. I also highly recommend that you avoid ideologues both on the right and the left who are pushing extreme views and takes related to evolutionary psychology or denying evolutionary psychology. My goal here is not to convince you of my personal opinion, because I don't think it matters. I'm not an expert. I'm just trying to summarize the science that's out there and defend it. So let's get into it. The first video I would like to respond to is called The Countless Controversies of Evolutionary Psychology, and this is from the channel Psychology with Dr. Anna. I think it's important to consider the background of any YouTuber or any person that you're getting your information from, and Dr. Anna is really well qualified to discuss psychology, way more so than I am. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology, a master's in clinical psychology, and also a doctorate of psychology in clinical psychology. So we're looking at about 9 years of education in psychology, and continues to research psychology to make videos on YouTube. And the actual thesis or conclusion of her video is quite nuanced compared to some of the other critical content on YouTube that I was seeing.
So, what are my conclusions from this whole debate? I think that evolutionary psychology probably holds some level of truth to it. I don't know how much, but I suspect it's not as much as evolutionary psychologists think it is.
Dr. Anna's statement here seems completely reasonable to me. You can tell that she has a really well-rounded scientific background because of the careful language that she's using here. She's not completely dismissive of evolutionary psychology, and it encourages a healthy debate among scientists about just how influential evolution is over our behavior. And from my perspective, my position is just that evolution has some influence over human behavior. How much influence doesn't make or break the rest of my philosophy that I talk about on this channel.
And I also think that theories hold power. And if you're creating a theory that could hypothetically be used to justify human rights violations by a naturalistic fallacy or not, I have to wonder why you're making that theory in the first place. Who is it benefiting? There better be some really good explanation or some really strong evidence that learning this is going to help us apply it to the fabric of society and be able to change things for the better, because if not, very questionable. If you're a big fan of evolutionary psychology, I don't necessarily think you're bigoted or that you were wrong. I just think, in my opinion, your energy might be better spent towards something that has more clinical applications or real-life applications.
Dr. Anna's emphasis on applications of research reflects the bias of her educational background as a doctor of psychology. This line of education is focused on clinical skills and hands-on practice, and should be contrasted with someone with a PhD who is more heavily focused on research. Not all scientific research needs to have clinical applications to humanity. I think about the example of the question of why do zebras have stripes? It's a classic scientific question related to evolution, and I was reading about it in the fascinating book An Immense World. The assumption has always been that zebras have stripes because it helps camouflage them from predators. However, recent research suggests this is a bad theory because they discovered that the predators who would hunt a zebra don't have a good enough eyesight to distinguish the stripes at the hunting distance that they would be hunting from. From their perspective, a zebra would just look like a gray blur. And so scientists have to go back to the drawing board and try and figure out how and why these interesting patterns would have evolved in the zebra. What value does this research have for humanity? It's unknown. We don't always know what applications science has for humanity, and sometimes there are surprising uses for the information that we learn. And this goes back to one of my main thesis points, that we should be getting information on psychology from people who are actively researching and actively publishing peer peer-reviewed science. I don't want to detract from Dr. Anna's really impressive educational background, but the opinions of leading experts really do carry more weight, and not actively researching in a relevant psychological field can easily lead to lapses of knowledge in the ongoing psychological debate. Consider Dr. Anna's critique of the waist-to-hip ratio topic in evolutionary psychology.
We also know that there are very few universals in this life across different tribes and cultures from the past and currently. EP ignores the role of culture because it has to. We don't know what this specific culture did. We only suspect that there were certain universals across all humans in that time period. But this often leads to evolutionary psychologists making the assumption that their own current cultural context and circumstances are applicable to everyone, essentially a form of ethnocentrism. For example, there's this common assumption in evolutionary psychology that the ideal waist-to-hip ratio, which is a marker of beauty among women, is 0.7. Yet studies from Peru and Tanzania show that it's more like 0.9.
The theory around waist-to-hip ratio is that men prefer women with a bigger difference between their waist and their hips, so that it looks like their hips are coming out wider in comparison to the waist. The theory behind this is that women who have a lower waist-to-hip ratio, or wider hips basically, are healthier and more fertile, more likely to safely produce offspring. What she called the Peruvian study, which was actually in Bolivia, used this image and also controlled for body mass. And you can see that the higher waist to hip ratio of 0.97 has a few different body mass index values as well. And what the study found was that when they controlled for the body mass index, it actually supported the waist to hip ratio research that has been previously conducted. This is word for word what they wrote in the study that they published. In summary, the results of our study support the hypothesis suggesting that waist to hip ratio lower than the average in a given population is preferred universally and is independent of ecological and cultural conditions. Some of the previous studies have also shown preferences for high waist to hip ratio in traditional populations, which would contradict evolutionary psychologists, but these were not properly controlled for body mass. The stimuli we employed enabled us to overcome this problem. Furthermore, since our participants preferred silhouettes of a low waist to hip ratio but a high BMI, this suggests that these previous results could be an artifact related to the employed stimuli. In other words, the study that she pointed to that was supposed to contradict evolutionary psychology actually supports the idea that low waist to hip ratio preference is universal among all cultures. It's also weird to say that evolutionary psychology ignores the role of cultures and then point to two different cross-cultural studies. I was able to find 4 more cross-cultural studies on waist-to-hip ratio, and the studies so far seem to confirm the universality of low waist-to-hip ratio preference among heterosexual men, and also explore what might be contributing to minor differences in this preference. This part of the video was the only major glaring error that I could find, and it's easy to make a mistake like this if you don't spend the majority of your time as a relevant researcher keeping up on the literature. Overall, Dr. Anna's video seems to be generally a valid critique of evolutionary psychology as far as I can tell. And I'd like to reiterate, I am not by no means at all an expert at evolutionary psychology or psychology in general. However, the video is definitely not a balanced overview of the topic, and I don't think it pretends to be. It is a summary of criticisms of evolutionary psychology. So if this is your only exposure to evolutionary psychology, I wouldn't say it's a good way to generally understand what evolutionary psychology is about. The video has currently about 65,000 views, and I'm about to respond to a video with about 30 times more views than this, and is unfortunately much less nuanced. Next, let's look at Munecat's video called I Debunked Evolutionary Psychology, and then in the image you see using science to manipulate. And science is in quotes. And you might think that this is just a clickbait title to say that evolutionary psychology is quote-unquote science, or that she's completely debunking evolutionary psychology. But as we'll see later, this is actually the position she's taking. It's a really hardline position, really extreme position in regards to the ability to evolve certain psychological biases or instincts or whatever. And I think the next logical question that we should all have, but maybe not necessarily we do have, the argument that I'm making in this video is that we should consider people's backgrounds, especially when they're making really strong claims in regards to science, is look at Munecat's educational background. And on LinkedIn, the educational background that she broadcasts there is that she went to Leeds Conservatoire and has a Bachelor of Arts in music production. So as far as I can tell, she has absolutely no background in science or psychology. And it's important to keep this in mind as we look at some of the stances that she takes. And a good place to start is to look at her coverage of the waist to hip ratio here.
Over on the most cursed corner of the internet, YouTube, EvoPsych is most commonly used in the context of giving dating advice, most of the time to men. It can be used to explain why you like big butts so much. It's because you're thinking about your potentially sexy daughters.
Studies show that women with lower waist to hip ratio are more likely to bear daughters who would also develop low waist to hip ratio, thus making it a heritable trait.
You will like big butts, and you will not lie. You other brothers can't deny.
The reason for this type of sexual preference has to do with bearing children. Specifically, women with wider hips are supposed to bear children with more ease.
When a girl walks in with an itty-bitty waist and a round thing in your face.
Further, females with 45-degree curvature would have had the advantage in foraging during pregnancy, as such body type would prevent them from spinal injuries.
Cool! Someone should tell the 90s, the 60s, and the 20s. Somebody should also tell the era of tuberculosis chic in the 1800s. I'm not sure those women were attempting to depict fertility. Oh, and could somebody go back 30,000 years and tell the makers of the Venus of Willendorf that the artifact they're making actually doesn't conform to 21st century beauty standards? Yeah, it's amazing and everything, but would the guy who made this YouTube video about arses stick his cock in it?
I wanted to start with Munecat's waist to hip ratio segment because it's indicative of the overall scientific quality of the video. You can tell she's tonally very dismissive of a very well established scientific theory. And then she uses anecdotal evidence, so she's using historic fashion trends, art, and artifacts as counter evidence. But it's also kind of strange because two of the images that she uses show women with an enormous waist to hip ratio. You could say that the images are actually unrealistically exaggerated waist to hip ratios, which is bizarre as a side point. But in the segment, there is absolutely no mention of the replicated scientific studies and all the cross-cultural peer-reviewed scientific studies that back up the heterosexual male's preference for high waist to hip ratio. And she mentions no peer-reviewed scientific scientific study as counter evidence to this scientific theory. The only other mention in this over 3-hour video of waist to hip ratio is at the 1 hour 5 minute mark. This segment is indicative of the rest of the video to the extent that Munecat uses peer-reviewed science selectively to prove her points. And I'll say this, it's actually extremely impressive how much research she's done in the video. But what's apparent if you do have like even a small background in evolutionary psychology is that she's cherry picking scientific studies and theories to back up a scientific opinion that is very much out of line with the general consensus. She does this in regards to waist to hip ratio, and we'll look at other really extreme examples of this. It can be pretty misleading because Munecat's video has some really good scientific moments in it where she uses the peer-reviewed process and peer-reviewed studies to provide an accurate current consensus on evolutionary psychology theories. For example, with spatial differences between men and women, as far as I can tell, that was a really good overview of that theory. For ovulation studies, she appeared to correctly use a meta-analysis to debunk some studies that were conducted by evolutionary psychologists on evolution. There was also an evolutionary psychology study around women in STEM where the results of that study were not replicated by a follow-up study, and then a correction or a corrigendum was issued by the publication, which is exactly how the scientific process should work and did work, and I think it's a testament to the awesomeness of science. I was initially really impressed with this segment about Dr. Tara Swart as well.
So this episode with #1 neuroscientist Dr. Tara Swart, and I think this is probably the best evolutionary psychology just so story I have ever heard.
Women who interact with each other physically closely, they synchronize their menstrual cycles. So whenever I want to explain something that's complex or I don't actually know the current neuroscience, I always take it back to what happened in ancient times. So when we were living in the cave, the men hunted and gathered and lived quite nomadically. So sometimes they would go away for months at a time. If they went far enough away and were closer to another cave of the same tribe, they would actually just stay there and never return to the original cave. But mostly they would leave for weeks or months and then return to the original cave. So if he was going to be away for months and he couldn't, there weren't men there to defend the women from predators, maybe there was going to be a spell of the ice age and they would all freeze to death or they wouldn't have food, he needed to make sure that at least 5 women were impregnated with his sperm at the same time. At least 1 out of 5 would survive. So to be able to do that, they had to be fertile at the same time. So that's why that mechanism exists.
Okay, so women don't even sync their periods! That doesn't even happen! This has 11 million views. This woman is a senior lecturer at King's College London. What is happening? What are we doing? Why is she saying all this?
I'm the Chief Science Officer at Heights. We've created the world's first smarter supplement in a really clever double capsule to deliver all your brain's key nutrient needs.
Oh, right.
Until I saw Munecat's video, I didn't know that the idea that women sync periods was debunked already. And I was surprised that this expert didn't know this either. And I thought this was a really good criticism of someone representing evolutionary psychology until I dug deeper, because Dr. Tara Swart is not at all a respected expert on evolutionary psychology. I'm not sure exactly what she lectures on at King's College London. It's hard to find any information about that. But at the MIT Management Executive Education lecturer job that she has, she runs a course on neuroscience for business. And here's the nuanced distinction I think that at the Diary of a CEO podcast, whose podcast she was on, but also Munecat seems to confuse. Lecturers are not equal to professors, and lecturers definitely are not leading experts in whatever they're lecturing on, even if it was directly evolutionary psychology, which is not in Dr. Tara Swart's case. And I hope that actual science journalists wouldn't make the mistake of presenting Dr. Tara Swart as an expert. It kind of just demonstrates the risks associated with so many people getting their information from podcasts and YouTubers on the internet. It's also a demonstration of how casually Munecat mixes experts and lay people throughout the entire video. And finally, it's an example of the logical fallacy known as the straw man fallacy. Instead of addressing an actual nuanced position in evolutionary psychology, you substitute the real positions for a weaker version and then knock it down really effectively. And all of these arguments, the really good arguments using peer-reviewed scientific studies, and then weaker arguments like this one are just blurred together throughout the video without really doing a good job of communicating who we're talking about. Munecat makes some general criticisms of psychology and science in general, and some of these criticisms highlight legitimate areas for improvement. She talks about the problems of using opinion surveys in psychology. She talks about the problem of using low sample size when studies are being completed. She talks about how replication of studies to verify that they are legitimate isn't attempted enough. And when a study is attempted to be replicated, they often aren't successful, which raises doubt about whether the initial study was accurate and whether a lot of the work that scientists do are accurate at all. However, I think that Munecat's criticism of science in general goes a little bit too far, especially here.
The brain doesn't tend to do a good job of analysing itself, and the reason for that is the very universal mechanism that makes our brains so adaptive. Bias. Emotions are logic, and science is not truth. Science is full of old white men, most of the women are white as well, who, whether they would like to admit it or not, are biased, and it's sending science in one wrong direction.
I agree with Munecat that representation of gender and ethnicity and sexuality all should ideally be fixed. But let's look at the numbers here in specific. According to this study of published scientific papers between 2010 and 2020, they looked at over 200,000 publications and found that 43.3% of the first authors of studies and 26.7% of the last authors of studies were females. So I imagine the reality would be somewhere between that. Women are definitely underrepresented, but I think there are opportunities for the perspective of a woman to correct the scientific biases of men, and I hope that increases throughout the future. You can also look at the racial representation. This is a study in America that shows in America the majority of scientists are indeed white, but in America there's overrepresentation for both white people and Asians as well. And I think this conception that science is only being done by white people really breaks down when you think globally about where research is happening. According to the journal Nature, the top country for publishing science currently is China. And I imagine that most of the researchers who are publishing science in China are not white. If you go down the list, the 5th most common country publishing science is Japan, the 7th most popular country publishing science is South Korea, and the 8th most dominant country is India. And I am making an assumption, but I assume that most of the people in those countries publishing peer-reviewed science are not white. This point might become even more clear if we look at this diagram of where scientific papers largely come from. Yes, North America and Europe definitely dominate the volume of papers published, but you can see that there are a lot of papers coming out of Asia, including China, Japan, South Korea, India, and Taiwan, all places where I'm sure most of the researchers are not white. And in the Middle East as well, we have Turkey, Iran, and also Egypt publishing scientific papers. So while I agree that there are definitely some biases influencing science, I disagree that it has completely corrupted science in general. Her argument reminds me of the arguments that climate change deniers make, who claim that climate science is completely bunk and there's some conspiracy to invent climate change by the New World Order. What's the difference between the argument that Munecat is making and climate change deniers? I believe that most scientists want to make a name for themselves. They want to change the consensus and make some sort of huge finding that has a big impact on their field. We know there are hundreds of thousands of scientists across the world. There's tens of thousands of universities, and there are tens of thousands of scientific journals throughout the world. And to say that all of them are involved in some sort of conspiracy is really, frankly, unbelievable. The scientific peer-reviewed process is the best source of truth that we have, and there really is no alternative to that, especially not from YouTubers or podcasters. Munecat seems to acknowledge the power of the scientific process, but also seems to think her own scientific opinions are just as valid as those of experts who have spent decades in the academic world and published peer-reviewed papers in scientific journals. To fully debunk all of evolutionary psychology, as Munecat says she's doing, you have to argue that genetics has absolutely no influence on human behavior, or that mental and psychological traits are not influenced by genetics in absolutely any way. I have done my best here to compile her argument around psychological traits, so it might look like it's heavily edited, but I had to edit it down to keep this video to a reasonable length.
When the idea was first proposed for the Human Genome Project, scientists were pretty excited about the prospect of being able to pinpoint specific genes for specific genetic health conditions, and perhaps, eventually, psychological traits. For a start, they were expecting to find around 100,000 genes, but there are only about 20,000 genes there. Nowhere near enough to pinpoint every human ailment, physical trait, and complex behavior. This simple inheritance model isn't even true for eye colour, and we still don't even know what's happening there for the most part, and that's a trait that's A, easy to measure, unlike any mental trait, and B, unaffected by environment, unlike any mental trait. And we've got so much longer to go before we even begin to understand what's going on here. One gene variant might only increase your chances of gaining 1 IQ point by a fraction of a percentage. We've found hundreds of genes with varying probability that they will affect your height, and look at the amount of people they needed to even get that far. But with mental traits, it's like all of your ancestors had an entire deck of thousands of cards, each card representing a small percentage of a mental trait, and Each card interacts with the other cards, and when they're passed down through generations, each time 2 packs of these thousands of cards get shuffled together with another, and then your individual genome and your environment picks which cards out of those thousands and thousands of different cards it wants to express. That means there's a lot more information there to create variance within a population. So, with each generation, a larger amount of variance occurs than you'd see within skin colour. Humans are a very visual species, and skin colour is the most striking, obvious visual trait, along with gender. But conflating simple visual traits with complex invisible traits is a trap scholars throughout history have fallen into. It's this kind of thinking that has led to racist assumptions in the past, which have been used to justify slavery. I think evolutionary psychologists fall into this trap with gender. Gender is a very visual trait which our culture has then thrown stereotypes onto and amplified, so they assume mental traits must work in the same way. It actually makes no evolutionary sense for mental traits to be wired in any way.
To say that psychological traits cannot be wired in any way is such an extreme scientific position. It's hard to emphasize just how out of touch she is with the science. This is an extreme behaviorist stance to say that all behavior is socialized into us. I can't find a single current relevant psychological researcher or scientist who would take such an extreme position. The scientific debate is more centered around not if our behavior is influenced by genetics, but just how much our behavior is influenced by genetics. Not just humans, but animals as well. But this is the length you have to go to fully debunk evolutionary psychology. You'd have to take the stance that genetics has absolutely no influence over animal behavior. But that's absolutely absurd. If no behaviors are hardwired, then how do the majority of sea turtles know to walk toward the ocean when they hatch? Was that socialized? There are no adult sea turtles around when they do hatch. It has to be hardwired into them to know to walk towards the ocean. Do all sea turtles walk towards the ocean? No, but the majority of them do. When you think about it, the topic of homosexuality poses great challenges for an extreme behaviorist like Munecat, and she discusses this topic here.
Consider the most recent cycles of culture that we've been through. Unironically, I often think about the Roman Empire. Male gay sex was essentially an extremely masculine thing to do, as long as you were the top. If we'd had behavioural scientists going around with their surveys during that era, how different do you think the results would have been in regards to how many men perceived themselves as queer in some way? Or how about ancient Greece?
I see Munecat's point on how society can influence the self-identification of homosexuals. The majority of progressives see sexuality as a spectrum, so maybe this phenomenon can push bisexuals in one direction or another. However, if psychological traits can't be wired in any way, then isn't the implication that Munecat is making that gay people are socialized to be gay at some point in their life? Doesn't this contradict the idea that homosexuality is an innate part of a person's identity? Aren't gay people born gay? Isn't it true that you cannot program a gay person to be straight? Isn't Munecat arguing that all homosexual and straight behavior largely socialized? Isn't it clear that this is an extreme position to take? Now, Munecat might argue, well, we can't explain homosexuality with evolutionary psychology either, and I'm completely okay with that. And this really doesn't disprove evolutionary psychology. The reality is that homosexual behavior is documented among literally hundreds of species besides humans. So homosexuality definitely appears to arise naturally. This is also a counter-argument to conservatives who subscribe to evolutionary psychology but dismiss homosexuality as unnatural. And let's ignore for a moment that these conservatives are making a naturalistic fallacy, that something being natural is at all relevant to whether it is ethical or not. The point I'm making to conservatives is that homosexuality appears to be very natural. So this is a good litmus test. The topic of homosexuality can identify hypocrisy among both people on the right and people on the extreme left, like behaviorists, like Munecat. Munecat's extreme behaviors stance is an example of extreme overconfidence, or hubris. Remember, this is a person with a music production degree, no significant academic background in science as I can tell, and she seems to think that her opinion is just as relevant as scientific experts. I'm trying really hard to keep this video under an hour, but here's a very quick review of what Munecat calls her variance for group fitness theory.
It makes no sense for all evolution to happen from the perspective of the survival of a gene. For biology to work around the goal of creating a genetic bottleneck by itself would be idiotically counterproductive. It would be self-sabotaging. It makes evolutionary sense for biology to create as much variance as possible in preparation for whatever environment or culture might come next.
You could say, but you're utilizing bias when you come to your variance for group fitness theory, and yes, I do concede that you could be correct, but I also don't have to concoct 29 conflicting just so stories to come to my conclusion. There's no paradoxes I have to resolve, there's just one biological narrative, and I have growing scientific consensus on my side. But sure, my bias is involved, and you can decide on whether you fully or partially agree or totally disagree.
Notice how Munecat is labeling the variance for group fitness theory as hers, and that you can disagree or agree with her. The reality is that her opinion on evolutionary theory is absolutely irrelevant to the scientific debate. It is extreme hubris to think that your opinion matters as much as scientific experts. Scientific experts have a decade of education in their field. They often have decades of research after they receive their PhD. Their theories are explored with the scientific method. This is their full-time job, and their research is vetted by their peers during the peer-reviewed process before it can be published into a study. And these are many other scientists with their same level of expertise. I think that the hubris of influencers like Munecat is best captured by science communicator and scientist David Suzuki.
That kind of got me into television as an educational tool. I got into it in a big way because I said, look, science is too important to leave to politicians or corporations. You, the public, have to understand science is impacting on our lives for good and for bad, but you better know what's going on. And now, when I look at the end of my life, the social media has absolutely destroyed television and programs as the most credible source of information. Some guy can wake up with a wart on his ass and say, that proves climate change is baloney, and get on social media and get a following. Like, what the hell?
When I started recording this video, I had absolutely no idea how heavily politicized evolutionary psychology is and how intensely it's been dragged into the culture wars. It's clear that there are people on both the right and the left side of the political spectrum that have misinterpreted this science and are miscommunicating the science to the rest of society. It's clear that evolutionary psychology has been pulled into echo chambers, and it does appear that a lot of people are selectively choosing what science to believe in order to fit their ideology. I definitely noticed this with climate change, and I'd argue the same thing has happened with evolutionary psychology. What I would argue is that people need to make more of an effort to be scientifically literate. We need to show more respect towards the scientific process and more respect towards scientific institutions. And I think we need to adapt our worldview and behavior to align with scientific consensus, not the other way around. So the next logical question probably is, how do we remain scientifically literate? What I hope I showed is that Munecat and Dr. Anna's videos are not educating people about science. I called Dr. Anna's video a critique of evolutionary psychology, but that's being a little bit generous. I think both videos, to different extents, are really hit pieces on evolutionary psychology. So what can we do? I think that the best source of information on science is to go directly to the leading experts. Munecat spends about 30 minutes of her video complaining about podcasts. However, I think sometimes the podcasters are doing a much better job of informing the public than she is. And podcasts are doing the best job of this when they're interviewing leading scientific experts on their shows. Podcasters are often accused of not asking questions that challenge the experts that they bring on their show. And I think the obvious solution to this is, instead of just interviewing one scientific leading expert, ideally we would have a debate between scientific experts who represent different positions in a scientific debate. You could do this as a formal debate or just have a panel of leading experts. And I think this is more or less important depending on the degree to which the topic is being debated in the scientific community. So, for example, if you wanted to inform the public about climate change, since over 99% of peer-reviewed science published in the last few decades supports the idea of anthropogenic climate change, you could just have one scientific expert on your show give a summary of what climate change is. But because the nature versus nurture debate is still so hotly debated, I think we need to see more of a debate online from the leading experts in psychology. And I tried to find an example of this to point you to, and it's a shame, but I really couldn't find a single example. If you found one, drop it in the comments. If you aren't able to get your information directly from leading scientific experts, I think you can look to YouTubers who create video essays on this topic, but be really mindful of where they're getting their information from. The best source of truth is meta-analysis of peer-reviewed scientific data, if it exists. The next best source of truth is probably expert summaries of whatever science exists dropped into their video. The next best source of truth behind that is probably individual studies that are published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. But as we've seen, sometimes there's an ongoing debate and peer-reviewed studies can contradict each other. And also, as we've seen, people can take the wrong conclusions out of studies, like we saw in the Dr. Anna video. And the worst possible source of truth is lay people's opinion about scientific topics, as we saw in Munecat's video. And one thing to look out for is not just where these YouTubers are getting their information from, but that they clearly identify their source of information, which isn't always happening. I try to follow all these rules in my videos, and I hope I did a good job in my climate apocalypse video and my climate psychology video, which were both heavily scientific. I originally planned to explore some of the stronger evolutionary psychology theories in this video, but I didn't have time to get to it. If you are looking to learn more about evolutionary psychology from leading scientific experts, I would recommend David Buss. When I took the evolutionary psychology course 20 years ago, he's the one who wrote the textbook that I read. And unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to go into this in too great a detail, but if you watch Munecat's entire video, it's clear that she's extremely disrespectful to David Buss, and I think it's really inappropriate. And to end this video, I just want to reiterate why I care about evolutionary psychology. Part of the reason is that I generally want to understand the world around me and human behavior. Not just how humans behave, but why we might behave the way that we do. Evolutionary psychology, I think, can also really help us understand our political landscape and what sort of biases are built into most people. And on that note, I think it's also helpful to understand the differences between heterosexual men and women, which seem to get supercharged as people spend more and more time online. My last video was about anthropocentrism, and I think that the denial of evolutionary psychology is one of the greatest examples of anthropocentric thought. It's clear to me that a lot of people really don't want to think of ourselves, humans, as animals. I think for a lot of people, that line of thinking is degrading to our species. And the argument that I made in my anthropocentrism video is that anthropocentric ideas have a long track record of being wrong and being disproven over time. Another reason why I'm interested in evolutionary psychology is that it boosts the underlying philosophy that influenced every video that I make on this channel. My philosophy is that we ought to act in such ways that help promote our chances of survival. In particular, I try to encourage people to take action on climate change. And part of my argument for why people should act in such ways to promote their survival is that we should be consistent with our previous behavior. And if a lot of our behaviors are heavily influenced by evolution, that's additional evidence that my underlying philosophy is worth adopting. Some behaviors, like our preference for high fat and high sugar foods, seem to be self-destructive and are thought to be driven by our evolutionary psychology. The theory is that those types of foods were not particularly abundant through our evolutionary history, and so we developed a preference for those types of foods. And if we do find them, it would be good for us to have a preference to eat large amounts for them, because we never know when we'll find those types of foods again. But if it's true that this behavior was heavily influenced by our evolutionary history, it's not true that we ought to embrace this behavior now. And that's another major argument of mine, is that we need to see the forest through the trees here. The underlying principle of evolution is survival. And that's the thing that we ought to embrace. However, if through scientific research it's proven over time that absolutely none of our behavior is influenced by evolution, I would accept that. And it doesn't necessarily destroy my philosophical argument either. It's still true that if you are alive today, you've done enough throughout the entirety of your life not to have died. And whether that behavior was influenced by evolution or not, I still have a legitimate argument that you should be consistent with your behaviors before. If you'd like to learn more about that, check out my survivalist utilitarian video. Thanks for watching this one till the end, and I'll see you in the next one.